So thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate having you here. I'm going to go ahead and begin our webinar. I know we still have people joining, but let's get started for the sake of time. So organizations around the world for many years have struggled to perfect a model for recruiting, onboarding, and stewarding their volunteers. Volunteers directly and indirectly affect the bottom line of the organization through their efforts and the revenue they produce, and yet oftentimes are overlooked or untapped resources for an organization. During this webinar, we look at how we can rouse the sleeping tiger of American volunteerism. So as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. This recording and the PowerPoint deck will be available to you via email, and then will also be posted on our website. So we look forward to also answering all of your questions today. So feel free to ask them, and to do that, you're going to want to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The Q&A button will allow you to ask questions at any time, and just know that if we don't answer it, we're probably waiting until we're done with some of our content to get to you, but we will get to you. So again, it's the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen. So now let's go ahead and meet our speakers. Kate, can you change to the next slide? So first is Kate. Kate is our account executive with Turnkey. Kate grew up playing sports in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia. Coming from a military family, Kate's parents taught a wonderfully nuanced blend of hard work, detail-oriented conversation, and fierce loyalty to one's cause. This upbringing and Kate's never-ending drive of excellence has led her to being Turnkey's first specialized project manager. As a project manager, she was able to pursue her passion in root cause analytics, process development, and workflow troubleshooting, all while building customer relationships, ensuring the customer receives what is promised. As an account executive, Kate has been able to speak to her experience from her different roles and lead in-depth conversations and problem-solving techniques on how to help organizations grow. Next is Allison. Allison is Director of Community Development for Nephrologists Kidney International. Allison is the current director, and she has been with nonprofit space for 25 years and have worked for 5 national nonprofits and 2 international nonprofits. Her career started in patient support, moved to education, then to peer-to-peer fundraising, and now to volunteer management. But in all of her roles, she has always managed volunteers to get the job done, so she certainly knows where that value is. And next is Otis, who is our Vice President of Psychological Strategy of Turnkey. And you are all very familiar with him, so we're going to go ahead and move forward and let Kate go ahead and begin our webinar. Thank you again for joining us today.
All right, I think I unmuted myself, Tessie. I think you muted all of us. That was probably wise of you. Hey all, we are so excited to have you here today. The evil plan is to chat with you guys about the slide content for about 30, maybe 40 minutes, and then have a lot of time for questions all at the end. But do ask questions throughout as well. Definitely feel welcome to do that. We wanted to start out with our definition of volunteers, so who we define volunteers to be. And for us in this context, we're talking about the volunteers that come in to donate their time, who are not paid to do so, or a board member. They're giving their time to help drive revenue and to also deliver on mission. So either side of that coin, if you're talking about revenue or mission delivery, this webinar topic is for you. Allison, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you were perfect. That it's not necessarily the leadership or the national board members.
Yeah. I think I wanted to specify that because Allison knows as well. You know, if you're on the board, you do give a lot, but it's a bit of a different conversation.
Definitely.
All right. So Allison is going to talk through a bit of her experience here.
Thanks, Kate. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Allison Kostiuk. Just want to give you a little bit of NephCure's journey. I've been here 4 years. That's a lovely picture of some of my local volunteers in Dallas. And just to give you a little context first, NephCure is a patient advocate organization in the rare disease space. We have 15 international employees. 10 working in the King of Prussia office, which is right outside of Philadelphia, and 5 working remotely. And 2020 marks the 20th anniversary of this small organization. So 2 years ago, August of 2018, our CEO came to me talking about the power of volunteers. And he asked me to create our regional volunteer community structure. These communities are kind of like chapters, except there are no brick and mortar offices, and the volunteer leaders do not have an immediate seat on our national board. So our leadership team and of all of our department heads came together, and we picked out those key markets, and we came up with volunteer job descriptions. We came up with about a dozen markets and 6 key volunteer roles. We sent out an email, and right off the bat, about 50 volunteers raised their hands. I interviewed them all, and we whittled it down to about 8 regional leaders, and then a few other key roles were filled. So right off the bat, we had engaged volunteers ready to go. So in these last 2 years, we have definitely ebbed and flowed from that original model that we set up. For example, when we created these existing roles, we really realized that some of those roles had one project, and then those volunteers just kind of sat around for the rest of the year. For example, our advocacy volunteers, they would go to DC, they would go up to Capitol Hill, and the rest of the year they really didn't feel like we were utilizing their time. Also, our local walk team captains. They would organize a walk team a certain time of the year, and then the rest of the year they felt like they weren't really giving back to our organization. So what we've really taken this time actually during COVID-19 was to see how we can really keep a year-round engagement going. So we came up with something called task or project volunteers. So what we do once a month is we reach out to these volunteers. We ask if they are willing and able to do this project. If they say yes, they say they do it. If they don't, they pass, and we reach out to them next month. So some of these projects range from calling donors to say thank you for your recent donation, calling senators to support kidney research and other important bills, or making a video to thank our healthcare providers during this time of COVID-19. We still have those standing volunteer roles, but those are for our more engaged and important roles. For example, those are truly our ambassadors, those regional leaders, those mini CEOs of our regions, for example, or our patient support volunteers, those that are reaching out to the newly diagnosed and really need to have a little bit more training. Next slide, Kate. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, we call our department is called the Community Development Department, and we really are developing these communities of volunteers, how we are scaling across the country with such a limited staff. So I want to talk a little bit about our true goals. So besides the day-to-day tasks of recruiting and managing volunteers, the main goals of our Community Development Department are the following, and we have 3 of them. We're strategically and effectively engaging volunteers to address NephCure's community needs. So just think about that for a minute. Strategically and effectively engaging volunteers. Not only are we engaging those volunteers, but we're operating within a culture of volunteerism that enables our organization to fundamentally leverage these volunteers and their skills that they bring to the table to achieve the goals of our organization's mission. And then this one really is, I think I'm gonna see a lot of people's eyes kind of, if I could see you, you'd all a light bulb would go off. We're integrating these volunteers into our strategic plan and our day-to-day operations, thereby allowing NephCure to reduce costs and increase efficiency and effectiveness in providing services to fulfill our mission through these regional volunteer communities. We're really harnessing that power of these volunteers to be efficient and effective with our limited staff. Next slide. So this is a picture of our limited staff all calling into a Zoom meeting. And we are all staying home for loved ones during the COVID-19. Many of them are patients as they are immune compromised. Many of you out there are probably staying home for loved ones as well. But this was really our tipping point of an organization, is fostering that culture of volunteerism through all the departments, not just the community development department. So really the tipping point for us was when we realized the following 6 important statements to be true, whether you're in the marketing department, the education department, or the development department, or the community development department. 1, volunteers are not free. Think about this for a minute. Think about it through the lens of a recruiter or someone in the human resources department. Just like recruiting the right job candidate for a paid position, it takes time finding and screening the right individuals for employment. These same mechanisms remain true of volunteers, and they cost money if you want to do it well. According to the Points of Light website, organizations are better off when they're incorporating a strong volunteer management model. These strong performing organizations require strong and well-developed human resource management practices over their volunteers. 2, the whole organization needs to embrace volunteer management. Organizations must plan for volunteer engagement strategically and embrace the concept that volunteer management is an organizational function and not just the function with the word volunteer in their title. 3, data collection is key. Make sure that you're collecting the right data to report back to key stakeholders and to make sure that your volunteer goals are being met. 4, have a solid, integrated communications plan. I know a lot of folks do newsletters. We do newsletters as well, but we send a different newsletter and different communications to our volunteers. They're an extension of our staff. We want to give them a little bit more information so that when they're speaking about our organization, they have that little bit more, that little bit more information, because they are on the front lines and they, again, are the extension of our staff and our ambassadors. 5, assess this important work that is being done. Do volunteer satisfaction surveys. Analyze your recruiting efforts. Are you meeting your goals? Are we using the right sources to get our volunteers? And this is a big one. Are we recruiting the right people to fill the right volunteer roles? Or are we just finding someone and putting a round peg into a square hole because we need to fill that volunteer role? And this is a big one. And this is management like this one, board members like this one. ROI. Building relationships with volunteers can give us a nice return on investment on our bottom line. Research indicates that every dollar invested into effective volunteer engagement practices leads to a $3 to $6 return on that investment. So as volunteers are more effectively integrated into an organization's operations, paid staff can focus on their program-specific functions they're uniquely qualified to perform. You spend $1 and your return is $3 to $6. It's a pretty good return. Next slide. We didn't switch the slides, sorry. That one, thank you. I want to end with the other one. I appreciate that.
I had one job here, guys. I had one job. I didn't do it.
Technical difficulties, that's fine. So I just wanted to quickly, before I end it, I just wanted to kind of give a snapshot of our organization and how in the last 2 years, like I said in the beginning of this, we started with 8 regional communities 2 years ago. We've grown to 17, as you can see on this slide, with 253 active volunteers. We have many more hundreds that are prospective in the way of being moved up and being trained. 3 of our regional leaders have transitioned to sit on the national board, which is wonderful. They're able to let those national board members know what's going on at that local level. That volunteer revenue, pre-COVID, they were bringing in $3.5 million, and most of that was in-person events. Because of COVID, we had to cancel our in-person events, so that is through appeals and through personal asks. Our volunteers are bringing in $2.1 million of income. And to give you a perspective, pre-COVID, our budget is $5 million, and during COVID, it's $3 million. So $2.1 million on a $3 million budget brought in by volunteers. We need to keep those relationships going and those volunteers happy. So to the right, you can see on this slide some other involvement that many of you on this call understand, that those volunteers have connections to major donors. They also connect with your new patients. They connect with your new sponsors. They connect with those that are new to your organization over a local coffee. They're there to support those, to tell them about the organization, how great it is to get involved, that peer-to-peer. They have local community knowledge, what doctor to see, what other organizations may work also with your organization. They have local connections. They're great at bringing in-kind sponsorships to your local walk, your local gala. They know the mayor, they know the chief of police, they know everybody. They're also, again, great volunteers, are great at recruiting volunteers. It's that peer-to-peer ask. They bring their husbands, they bring their friends, they bring their wives. And then that last bullet is the common thread database. So this is a volunteer software of all those connections above. How do we keep track of all those volunteer connections? So Common Thread is a wonderful database of volunteer software that keeps track of all those volunteer connections, and then can work, we use Salesforce, but can work with other CRM systems to really keep track of all those local connections that volunteers are doing on your behalf. So Kate, can we go back to that previous slide? So actually, drum roll please. When your organization has resources, analytics, a strategic plan, and assessment tools, your volunteers will be able to rule the world, right? No, honestly, they will be able to exponentially increase your productivity. And I'm not saying anything that the rest of you on this call don't already know. But I just wanted to kind of go over a few things on this, and then we will continue on and also open it up for questions. But let's think about this. If you had all of these things in place, you'll be able to increase human resource capacity with limited additional expense. How wonderful, right? As of April 2019, independent sector announced that the latest value of a volunteer hour is $25.43, which is up 3%. But the last time I looked at this, it was $24. So this is the national average. But by city, the hourly rate goes from $12 to $41. So, and that is, we're getting this for free. Volunteers will also be able to increase hours contributed annually to your nonprofit and to the work that you do. Volunteers will also use their skills to retool operations. Volunteers have skills that we can't really afford sometimes. Wonderful, wonderful skills and experience. Volunteers will be able to meet the community needs through organizational growth at the community level. They're in the community. And volunteers will take local and national programs to scale. So I want to end on this quote.
Allison, but before you end, could I just ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
You know, I think everybody understands having a strategic plan, working volunteers into the plan and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about the analytics and assessment tools that you all implement? Because I think that that's where people really are in a little bit of a gray area. I don't want to throw you a curveball, but I'd be very interested myself
No,
to hear about it.
I'm so glad. I think sometimes I'm so ingrained in it, I kind of forget to
Sure,
get
yeah.
myself out of it. So that was actually what really helped us. So we use Salesforce, and it's very internal, but there were kind of two buckets, if you will, of information that we realized we were missing, right? And connections that were happening that we were not able to analyze because it was data we were not getting. And the two buckets were, one was that volunteer to volunteer connections. So our leaders were managing other volunteers, and we were working off spreadsheets. So as we were recruiting volunteers in, say, Atlanta or LA, we were just sending these volunteer leaders lists and email addresses. There was no way for them to send a text out to all their volunteers or send an email out and then us to capture that on these records. Because a lot of our volunteers, and for a lot of organizations, they are somehow personally connected to the cause. So that was the one bucket, and we use Common Thread. So it then syncs with our Salesforce. The other bucket was our newly diagnosed patients. So our newly diagnosed patients were being welcomed to our organization by volunteers. And you know what, I correct myself, there's three buckets. I'll go over the third bucket, which everybody on this call may labeling their own buckets. The second bucket was the newly diagnosed, those that may never have heard of our organization, right? So these volunteers are reaching out, giving a warm welcome and saying, here's a community of support to walk you through this new journey you're going through. But we had no way to capture all of these wonderful relationships that were happening and moving them along the pipeline, not only to being introduced to our organization, but future volunteers and future donors, future board members, future event chairs. That third bucket was the reach outs that were happening to our nephrology population. And again, folks on this call can label those buckets however they may want to, but ours are, our volunteers are also reaching out to nephrologists. So for us, nephrotic syndrome is a very rare kidney disease. There is a population of physicians that don't know that we exist as an organization to connect to their patients. So our volunteers are reaching out to these physicians, but we don't know who has a relationship with which physician, and we can leverage that for education purposes, for speakers at events, to recognize at galas or other large events. So that's a great question, Otis, that's where we made a big jump and a big leap to have this volunteer software. It's also an app, so it's very easy for these volunteers to just make their connection and then move on. And then we have that data when we as staff may be talking with, say, I understand you just talked to Sally, one of our volunteers. That's wonderful. So it just is very seamless.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm so glad you asked.
Good.
I'd like to point out one thing about what you said with the average savings of having an hour of volunteer work being about $25. That's the stat you said, right? That's about
absolutely right.
How much money you're saving by having an hour of a volunteer's time, which makes total sense. But a lot of the conversations that we have these days are for staff and for volunteers. Okay, if you weren't stuck doing that thing or, having 8 spreadsheets open on your computer, what could you be doing? So there's the staff cost, the labor cost of about $25 an hour on average. You could have a volunteer that's a very high level or, newer, that could change that dollar amount. But I think the important thing to also consider when talking, especially with leadership, is, okay, but if in that hour they raise money, you've got the labor savings, and then you also have that profit opportunity, which the reverse is lost profit opportunity, right? So every hour you spend, I'm in the spreadsheet or I'm doing that work, is a lost profit opportunity. So you can quantify that as well and potentially have a $100 win for 1 hour of work.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right.
A question did come in. Thank you so much. We got our first question, guys, unless I missed one while I was, off in space. about Common Thread. We're going to talk a little bit more about Common Thread in a little bit, about when you could use it. So we'll definitely get into that in a little bit, and we can always circle back with you after this call as well to talk about it. So I am going to switch the slide. I think we're good here.
We are good. I didn't get to end with my quote. Can I end with my quote?
Oh, please say a quote.
Only because it's exactly what you just said, Kate. It's exactly what you just said. So it's a good segue. It's exactly what you just said, except for it's the CEO of volunteermatch.com said it. So Greg Baldwin is the CEO of volunteermatch.com, and he says, as Americans, we are remarkable. Of course, in 2018, our generosity was greater than the profits of Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Google combined. The freedom to voluntarily associate with the people, groups, and causes we care about is what makes democracy possible. But exercising that freedom is what makes democracies great. Volunteers together gave more if we had paid them than the profits of those organizations put together. Volunteers can change the world. They really can. So back to you, my friend.
Awesome. Well, we actually are going to talk about the world that we're in today once I get past the slide. So we wanted to approach this part of the opportunity. It's not really a problem. The opportunity, kind of looking at it in two different views. First is, the volunteer structure or volunteerism in nonprofit organizations pre-COVID, things that we've been seeing across the space for years and years that we are hoping to change one webinar at a time. And then also the COVID-19 reality that we're in. And I know that at the poll at the beginning, we had about 60% of people on this call wanting to talk about specifically what can we do with our volunteers during COVID-19. So we will touch on that as well. So first, Allison, to put you on the spot, tell us about the volunteer structure that we've had in the industry up until COVID hit.
I think we all know probably on this call, what is not new is that we do not collect a lot of data on our volunteers. We really don't know what connections they're bringing or what income they're bringing to the table. As we stated earlier, and probably a lot of people know, they do have those local connections. They're bringing sponsors. They're warmly bringing new folks. They're our best ambassadors. It's just that peer-to-peer. But we don't capture that data. We really don't. We're not reporting it to our biggest stakeholders, to our sponsors, to our board members. And we're not really tying them to revenue in a meaningful way. But let's think about this for a minute. If all of our volunteers were to walk away tomorrow, what would we do? What would we do? And I think also what is not new is, probably when I said a few slides ago that volunteers are not free, a few people on the call might have thought, oh, I never thought of it that way. But, I don't work for free. They are not free. We still need to manage them. We really do need to. I was at a conference a year ago, and the speaker said something that stuck with me. You steward a volunteer like you steward a donor. They are donating their time. And a lot of times, your biggest volunteer, your strongest, most connected volunteer, they would probably be your biggest donor if you asked them. Right, Kate? We've talked about this before. We just think because they're giving us their time, we shouldn't ask them for money. But why don't we? We don't. That's another one that's not new either, is we kind of silo. We silo our donors and our volunteers, but they're both volunteering something that is precious to them. Time and money, two very precious commodities. So Kate's going to move on. And what's new now?
Yeah. So what is new now? So at Turnkey, I talk with a lot of different people. So I've heard a few different scenarios going on. One is, Kate, I have older volunteers who have been stuck in their ways for a very long time. They've liked the way that they've been helping for the past 2 decades. And you can't expect me to expect them to become professional live stream gamers overnight during all of this, right? And that's 100% appropriate. So I'm not demeaning that at all. That experience is real. We also have heard from some people that while we have those volunteers, we're also getting an influx of new faces. So new volunteers, maybe the crowd that wants to raise their hand and say, I want to help this become a virtual thing. I want to help your website become, this new thing. So we've seen new volunteers come in, and maybe the problem is like, what do we do with them? Maybe we're having volunteers raise their hand and we don't have a role for them yet. Allison, I think you could speak to that a little bit without naming any names, what you've experienced recently, right?
I'm so glad you said that. So I was doing a little bit of prep work before this call, and also to make me better in my job, I started volunteering for other organizations, just filling out their contact us or volunteer, just to see what their turnaround time was, to see, and 3 different organizations never got back to me, which I thought was very surprising in this time. Now, are they limited on resources because of our current pandemic and staff aren't there? I don't know. I'm going to take a little bit of grace here on this, but it was just, I found it very interesting that 3 different organizations, national organizations, did not get back to me when I was saying I would be willing to volunteer for them. So
yeah, and something that I've experienced, I just so everybody knows, part of my credibility in being on this call and being honored with talking with Otis and Allison today is I've been a volunteer for Hands-On Greater Richmond. My project is Support One. I do birthday parties with our clients with intellectual disabilities. It's so fun. And I've been doing that for about 8 years. And for me as a volunteer, and from what I've heard from some clients as well, is in the COVID-19 world, some of the impression is there isn't any work to do. So, I'm here, I'm able to volunteer, but how do I do that from the context of my own home in a place where I'm comfortable and not making anyone else uncomfortable? I am sure that with, a person like Allison, if Nepher was who I was volunteering for, we could sit down and come up with something like what she mentioned. I absolutely love the project volunteers that she mentioned. And I want to highlight that really quickly, Allison, because I've never heard of that before. And I think it's amazing. So you have the ability to let the volunteer set his or her own pace. And especially right now with COVID-19, I know Otis is going to get into a bit of the psychology of the importance of that in a second. But if we can define and set the scope of what help we need during this, volunteers will help. If we make the ask, they will help. So is there anything, Otis, Allison, you want to add to the current COVID-19 landscape? Anybody want to comment in something you're experiencing as well? We're going to hop into the psychology of this momentarily. All right, Otis, let's get into the science.
Very good. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being with us. Next slide. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about motivating volunteers. I'm a social psychologist, and when I talk about research and say people behave like this, I'm speaking in averages. Most people, there's always somebody's weird Uncle Cyril like I had who won't be normal, but this is how most people respond when psychologists interact with them. There's been an area of psychology for about the last 30 years called positive psychology, and kind of broadly, it's the study of what makes life worth living. And positive psychologists have found that there are 3 things that people who are satisfied with various aspects of their life have in common. This is called self-determination theory for you psychology nerds out there. You want to Google it. Next slide. First, people who were satisfied with aspects of their life, they have a sense of autonomy. They feel they have autonomy. Autonomy is the desire to be self-directed. We don't want to be micromanaged. We want to chart our own course. And, giving someone autonomy tells them, I trust you. And this is very powerfully rewarding. So when we're talking about volunteers, are we giving them some latitude in the things that they do for us? Kind of do it, I trust you to get this done. I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do it necessarily. Set up some guardrails, but that's very important. Second thing is what psychologists call competence. Competence is doing important work and having the opportunity to get better at it or mastering something. Fundraising is frankly a very good example. It's got some very easy benchmarks just in the amount of money that you raise. You can become an expert at fundraising, and we often recognize people for doing that. And finally, being part of something bigger than themselves. That's kind of the definition of volunteer involvement. Psychologists refer to this as people's desire for connectedness. And, to the extent that you can show them that they're an integral part of your organization, they're going to feel that connectedness. And this is the formula for having satisfied volunteers that are going to come back and stay with you over the long term. And, this is really, really important right now. Next slide, Kate. Right now people are feeling a lot of negative emotions. The coronavirus has made people feel powerless. It's taken away that sense of autonomy. They feel stressed from any different angles. God, I was stressed a couple of weeks ago just about getting a haircut, for cripe's sake. The sources of stress are so many. Are our kids going to be able to go back to school? And more people are feeling isolated. And I think that right now, volunteerism can be a great gift for people. Next slide. Psychologists have done a lot of research on this and have shown that pro-social behavior or just doing something for the greater good or for somebody else is really a powerful mitigating factor. It really reduces stress in everyday life. So right now, it's a great time for people to become involved in volunteerism, and they're going to feel really positive effects from their involvement with you. Next one. And how does it impact this trifecta of satisfaction, as we call it? Powerless. You're going to be able to create opportunities for them to take action. That C should be with the re-8. You're going to which restores their sense of autonomy. You're going to as we know, be able to provide opportunities to do good that is going to reduce their stress. And really important here, to tell them what their support accomplishes. I do a lot of copywriting for our clients, and over, I use the phrase, because of you, B-O-Y, because of you, we were able to do this and that. And that is a powerfully affirming statement that will really impact how they feel about themselves and their relationship to your organization. And then finally, you're going to break their sense of isolation, just reminding them that they're part of a community of people who feel that doing this kind of work that they're involved in is really, really important. Next. And just to close, I want to tell you about some, when you're asking for people to volunteer, you're asking them in a sense to do you a favor, to do something for you on behalf of the organization. And I want to tell you about some research that was done at Stanford University a few years ago by a friend of mine, John Jecker, a social psychologist there. He wanted to test how people felt after doing someone a favor. So how might your volunteers feel after doing something for your organization? So what happened was this: he had subjects come in to the experiment, and they played a game where they were allowed to win some money. They won about $10. Each one of them does. The game was rigged, as social psychologists often do. They rig these situations. And after the game, three things happened. Well, one of three things happened, depending on what condition that you were in. Some of the subjects were approached by the researcher, who said, hey, listen, that was my own money out of my own pocket. I just realized I don't have money for gas to get home. I'm going to have to ask you for that $10 back. Some of the other subjects were a third party came into the room and introduced themselves as the department chairman. And she said, you know, John shouldn't have been giving you that money. That was actually the department's money. So you're going to have to return that money to the department. I'm so sorry. And then the third condition, the subjects just got to keep the money. And so the question was this: after that happened, who liked the researcher more? Next slide. Was it the people who were asked by the researcher for the money back? Was it the people who were asked by somebody else for the money back? Or was it the people who got to keep the money? A very simple question. They did a little 10-point scale. Who liked the researcher more? So, Tessie, do we have a poll now? Is that correct? I'm not sure. Yes, we do. So if you'd like to just quickly knock out that poll, what do you think? Who liked the research more? People asked by the researcher for the money back, somebody else for the money back, or people who got to keep the money? Tessie, let's tell them what they won. Let's see what the poll results were. All right, people asked by the researcher for the money. You would say that. Next slide, please. Overwhelmingly, you were right. It was people who were asked by the researcher for the money back that liked them more. In fact, it was, again, an overwhelming kind of an effect. Next slide. So, you know, what's happening here? This is what's known as the Ben Franken effect by psychologists. And simply it's this: when we do someone a favor, we end up liking them more. And often it's more than if they had done a favor for us. And I'm not going to get into the why that happens here. It's named the Ben Franken effect because it's kind of a deep explanation. It's named the Ben Franken effect because back in the 1730s, Ben Franklin, he had a bitter political enemy, and he wrote, Ben Franklin had a well-known library, and he asked the guy, his enemy, he found out he had a rare book. He asked the gentleman if he could borrow the book. He loaned him the book, Ben Franklin the book. He returned it, and after that, Ben Franklin wrote about this guy had a huge turnaround in his attitudes about him. Now he was acting very friendly towards him. They sponsored legislation together. They were legislators. He was being invited to dinner, and he wrote about this remarkable thing. That's how it became called the Ben Franklin effect. But our takeaway is this: you know, our requests of our supporters, it's not a zero-sum game. And here's the important thing: it's actually the case that every act of support or volunteerism that someone does for our organization has the opportunity for us to increase their affinity for our organization. So the more that they're doing for us, the more they're going to like us. The one caveat is we've got to recognize them for doing this stuff. People want to be recognized, and it's very important that we just say thank you. What you're doing is important work, and we value what you're doing. And so finally, I'd just like to talk a little bit about making the ask of the volunteer. Allison talked earlier about our reluctance to ask people to volunteer, people who have donated to volunteer, and vice versa. So last slide, Kate, please. This is data from the National Awareness, Attitudes, and Usage Study. And I know this is about donating, but the same principle holds true for people who volunteer. This study surveyed 98,000 donors who had previously given between $250 and $2,500 a year for multiple years annually to cultural institutions like museums, symphonies, et cetera. But then they'd stop donating for some reason. And they asked them why they stopped donating after they donated for multiple years. And the most common reason that people gave was they just weren't acknowledged or thanked for the previous gift. The second most common was they weren't asked to donate again. And we have this idea that we can't go back to the well, we're asking people too much. The very last reason that people gave for why they stopped donating was they were asked too often. And yet, you know, how many times have we heard, gosh, you know, people have just donated, we can't ask them to donate again. There's actually research that shows that the people who have just donated are much more likely to donate if you ask them to donate very quickly after they've donated before. So our takeaway here is don't be afraid to ask people to volunteer. People desperately need these opportunities to become connected with organizations. And it's a great gift that we can give them right now. So break through that reluctance, if you have it, to ask them to volunteer.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Otis. I just looked at my clock. I don't know if you guys are watching the clock, but we are way over my goal of 30 to 40 minutes. So I'm going to go through this next progression relatively quickly. Know that we will cover in more detail if you need to, based on your questions. So I'm going to go through this. So what does it all mean? Let's put it all together, what we talked about, and let's talk about where you can get tripped up within your organization. And also know that this is not a one-time thing. This ebbs and flows. So where you're tripping up today will be different from where you're tripping up next year, and that's common. So first is if you don't have enough volunteers or the right volunteers. So some of the ways that we can address that is use predictive modeling to find out who a better volunteer fit would be using your CRM. So just all of the records that you have in your database, we could do some predictive modeling to find out who the best volunteers would be for you. Next up would be, okay, you've got some volunteers, but maybe you don't have the data to make any kind of, actual changes within your organization in direction. So how can we start to collect the data? Or is your data bad? Is the data that you're collecting completely not trustworthy, or you've switched CRMs in the last couple of years? Those are some of the common data problem causes. And for that, what we would encourage you to do is if you're just starting out and you have zero data, let's start you out in some spreadsheets, start tracking what your volunteers are doing so that we can begin to get an idea of the impact that they're having out there in the field for you. If you have data already, we can start to do some analytics on that front. And you can reach out to Allison for specifics as well. I know that she and I discussed maybe getting on a call with anybody interested, and we can help start to gather the correct metrics so that you can report to leadership and potential corporate sponsors as well. Okay, so you might have the volunteers, you might have the data, but you might not have the method in place internally to make decisions with those things. So really, are you using your time and your resources correctly in order to get the biggest lift for your mission you're trying to get? So for Turnkey, what we call this is a decision-making model, which we help people with each and every day. But it's really just looking at those resources, have they been utilized wisely, timely, in a way that we can move forward as a team. So you might have the volunteers and the data, you might have an amazing decision-making model, but you might not be communicating it out to your volunteers or your constituency. So what is your communication plan so that everybody can have managed expectations, everybody on each part of that project? Another thing, once you've done all of those things, is to do the execution, do the volunteering, recruit. I know Allison and I have gotten into plenty of conversations in the past because we love this stuff. And we've talked about the difference between recruiting and managing and the challenge that a staff person could have of which one to focus on. And it's the age-old fundraising question too. Do we work on acquisition or do we work on activation or retention? And I will say right now, the numbers that I'm seeing across the industry right now is there's a bigger lift currently for the retention effort, for activating people who've been returning to you year after year after year versus a ton of new acquisition. No, the contradiction to that is how cheap the digital space is right now. So there is acquisition there to be had. But I did just want to say that you might see within your constituency, if you had to pick one to prioritize, maybe picking the managing. And last but not least is assessing all those things that have already happened. And did you assess it in the correct way to make the right decisions to bring everything full circle? And so we can do lots of fancy statistics for you guys, coaching, project management, rollout, those sorts of things. And we are happy to help with any of those things. Allison, did you want to jump in with anything I might have missed?
No, I'm so glad you brought up the recruiting versus managing, because that's the, if I could do both, what would I, that's a great question. And people's like, well, I need 2 staff. I need one to do recruiting. I want to do managing. But I think what you said is really looking at your data and see who you already have involved. A lot of times it's easier to retain somebody than to go and get a new somebody, because that somebody that's already in your database has already loved you once. They're more likely to, it's more cost effective to re-engage them and to get them to love you again.
So I do want to touch base, just because we did have that question earlier and I made a promise to talk a little bit more about Common Thread, which is a tool that we use with a wonderful partner of ours. And the reasons Allison and I got into those conversations were the following. So she is focusing on the data piece at her organization. She's got amazing volunteers. She's looking to get out of spreadsheetville and be delivering data in a dashboard way to corporate sponsors, to the nephrologists, to everybody affected by her mission delivery. And then there's also, if volunteers are being given responsibility, we don't necessarily want them to have access to our CRMs, right? Like, they could break something. And it could also be really intimidating for a volunteer to go into this ginormous database and go, you wanted me to log what? So Common Thread is a great amelioration between giving the volunteer really explicit scope and tools and guidance on what work can be done, but without giving them, the keys to the castle. And so it's that layer in between, and we've got APIs and there's a whole bunch of technical stuff behind there, but really those were the main reasons. And it was to document the processes. How do we onboard a new volunteer? How do we track? How do we communicate? And what are those relationships that are happening across all of those different connections to help soft credit in our data all the revenue that they're driving for our organization? Allison, you want to add anything to that?
So the only thing that I also wanted to add, and you kind of just addressed it, is that onboarding and the knowledge base of Common Thread keeps track of that. So if you need a volunteer to watch an onboarding and a training video, you can keep track of that in Common Thread too. So you can see where they are on that pipeline. They're a brand new volunteer. They've watched their training video. They filled out, their information form, and then they're ready to go. So it's a little less back and forth of email or phone calls, and you can see right when they're ready to be activated and they're ready to go. So that's a nice function of the Common Thread platform as well.
Yeah.
It saves time, and then they're ready, they're trained, and they're ready to hit the ground running.
All right, well, I'm very sad to say this because we've been having such a good time. The 4 of us have been like maniacally giggling for a few days now, getting this ready for everybody. But we are finished up with our time. I'm gonna be emailing everybody who attended today just to thank you and to ask for your feedback, because Allison and I are always looking to improve and make sure that we deliver the most meaningful content. So keep an eye out for an email from us so that we can follow up with any questions that you have in your specific situation. I feel like I need to like give a goodbye kiss.
Thank you, everyone, and wear a mask.
All right, bye.
Be safe, everybody. Thank you.